I'm proud to be able to announce we have a new member with us, Betty Pruitt, and Betty's sitting right back here. Raise your hand, Betty. She's right back here, and glad to have you as a part of our church family, Betty. I also want to second what Jacob said about Kairos. I want to encourage you to go by and look at what they have displayed out here in the North Foyer. I know some of you are looking for places that you can minister, do something for the Lord, and so stop by there and talk to them and see if that might be something that's exactly for you. Beverly and I, as you know by now, we love to travel. And there are some places that we have been where you feel so little as you stand in such awesomeness. And I've shared some of those with you. The Grand Canyon did that for me. My mouth just hung open as I looked at the Grand Canyon. And Niagara Falls was that way for me too. And the Redwood Forest, as you stand and you just look up over a football field high, it's just incredible. And then the times that Beverly and I have gotten to spend in a boat on the Sea of Galilee, where you just feel so small in the presence of such awesome things that have happened there. And this is the same dynamic that occurs in our hearts as we draw near to the starkest, the most awesome display of God's glory, the cross of Jesus Christ. The letter of 1 Corinthians addresses how to have unity in a divided church. And last week we looked at chapter 1 and verses 10 to 17, where Paul just jumped right into this mess, and he confronted this church about their divisiveness and about their arguing and quarreling. Because what they were doing was they were sabotaging the church's influence in the city of Corinth. In today's text, Paul's going to follow right up on that, and he's going to give us the cure for division. The cure for division is the gospel. And we often think of the gospel as something that unbelievers need to hear, and certainly that is true. Unbelievers need to hear the gospel. But let me remind you that all of Paul's letters were written to believers. And Paul is encouraging those believers to hear and to understand the gospel. And the heart of the gospel is the cross. So, he says in verse 17, this is what we closed with last week. He said, "For Christ did not send me to baptize." And again, Paul's not diminishing baptism here, and we could go back. If you haven't heard my lesson last week, go back and listen to it, because I'll discuss this. He said, "For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom and eloquence, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power." So the theme of today's text is the power of the cross. The cross is the cure for all human division. And so he opens this section by saying this: "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate." Now, the cross is a fact of history. When it comes to the Christian faith, we do not begin with philosophy, we begin with facts. One of those facts is something that was touched on in our Lord's Supper talk just a while ago by John. One of those facts is that God came in the flesh. That God came as a human being and lived among us. And another fact is the cross, the crucifixion. Part of what we declare is that something strange happened in the city of Jerusalem to Jesus of Nazareth. That he was executed for a crime that he did not commit. But primarily, the cross is about justice. It's about judgment. Paul will later, and we're going to talk about that this morning, he's going to later refer to this as the scandal of the cross. And it's this: we are all sinners. We are all under the judgment of God. But the greatest human being who ever lived became our substitute. He took what we deserve. And in this marvelous exchange lies the scandal of the cross. The very reason that many people stumble over the cross. Because the cross suggests that good efforts and self-improvement is really pretty worthless when it comes to ransoming us from sin. And for many people, even some religious people, this is insulting. And so Paul acknowledges that the message of the cross produces basically two reactions. He says, number one, it is foolishness to those who are perishing. 5 times in 8 verses, Paul is going to use the word foolishness. And the Greek word is moria, from which we get our word moron. Okay? Paul is saying that, within this word, there is something ridiculous. There is something contemptible. And Paul is saying that many people consider the cross to be moronic. At the top of the list of reasons is it offends our pride. One of the greatest challenges in sharing the gospel with non-believers is when you come up with someone who has a sense of self-sufficiency. To suggest to that person that their impressive achievements cannot purchase salvation for them. You run into the offense. You run into the scandal of the cross. And further, for many, it just doesn't make sense. One man dies on the cross and that determines the destiny of all of humanity? We could get lost in a long theological discussion of the cross and all of the implications of the cross. We could spend several hours doing that, but I'm going to spare you that this morning. But ultimately, I want you to know it comes down to this. I don't have to completely understand something to benefit from it. For a number of years, I worked in a utility plant making electricity. But I got to tell you, I don't know a whole lot about electricity. I know some of the theories about it, but I don't fully understand electricity. But you know what? I'm really grateful for what electricity provides for me, even though I don't understand it. I enjoy its benefits. Every time I flip on a light, I enjoy the benefits of electricity. And I used to change the oil in my car. I don't do that anymore because it's too convenient, and it's hard to, first of all, it's hard to get rid of the oil that you take out of your car, but it's just more convenient to take it and have someone else do it. But that was about the extent of my auto mechanics, okay? But I sure do enjoy the benefits of being able to get in a car that'll just take me wherever I want to go. I don't understand it, but I sure enjoy the benefits. And so it is with the cross. Second, Paul says the other option of how to view the cross is that it is the power of God to those who are being saved. The cross is the key to releasing all God's blessing into our lives. At the cross, our hearts are healed. At the cross, we are delivered. At the cross, we are redeemed. At the cross, we are freed from sin. At the cross, we enjoy wholeness and peace and joy. In verse 19, Paul actually quotes from Isaiah chapter 29 and verse 14. And I want to give you the backstory real quickly about what's happening here. It was written at a time when Judah was being invaded by the Assyrian Empire, the most powerful empire in the world at that time. And all the statesmen of Israel and all the politicians were scheming together, including King Hezekiah, trying to find out some way out of this dilemma that they were up against. They were resorting to human ingenuity. They were resorting to political scheming. They even attempted to get Egypt to join them in an alliance against the Assyrians. But God spoke through his prophet Isaiah, and he announced to Israel that he was going to deliver the people with no help from human beings. And that's when he said what we read in chapter 29 and verse 14. Therefore, once more I will astound these people with wonder upon wonder. The wisdom of the wise will perish, the intelligence of the intelligent will vanish. Then Isaiah goes on to explain how God accomplished this in real history in chapter 37. The Assyrian army, they come right up to the gates of Israel. They're surrounding the city. There's tents all the way around the city. And they are ridiculing the Israelites, and they're mocking them and taunting them. And King Hezekiah can see all of this. And then their leader, the king Sennacherib, actually wrote a letter and sent it to King Hezekiah demanding his surrender. Well, Hezekiah took that letter and he laid it before the Lord and he prayed about it. And that night, the Lord answered his prayer. And the Lord struck all of the Assyrian army with illness so that they died. This is attested to historically, but it's explained away by saying there was a plague that broke out among the army. Yeah, there was a plague that broke out among them. It was what God had done. And now Paul picks up on that. How God doesn't need the help of anybody to deliver Israel. Paul picks up on that and he applies it to the cross. And here's what he says. He says the same thing is true for human redemption. God doesn't need your help. He's done it through the cross. Now at this point, Paul examines the wisdom of the world versus the wisdom of God. And he begins by asking 4 rhetorical questions. He asks, where is the wise person? Where's the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know God, he was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached. Hey, by the way, that doesn't mean preachers are foolish, okay? Some of them are. God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Paul is speaking here of the philosophers of the age, of the religious scholars, of the debaters. What do these people have in common in this Jewish Greco culture in which they live? They were the experts. And God's wisdom, Paul says, makes those experts look foolish. Now realize this. Paul was a brilliant man. Paul was an intelligent man. Paul was a well-trained, educationally, a well-trained man. Paul is not discounting knowledge here. God created us as human beings to be inquisitive. And humans have unraveled and discovered millions of secrets hidden in the universe. And there have been medical advances, and there have been psychological advances, and there have been agricultural advances, and all kinds of advances that have bettered the human condition. But knowledge is the discovery of truth, and wisdom is the employment of that truth. And Scripture says that there is something faulty about human wisdom. There is something faulty about applying the truth that we have. We don't always know how to use truth. And unfortunately, all of those things where we have made advances can also be used by human beings to hurt us. Medical advances, well, there's things humans can do with those advances to actually hurt people. Agriculturally, in any other way, those things can be used against us. And the reason is that human wisdom often fails to acknowledge the greatest fact of all, which is God. Someone has said, and I love this, I don't know who to attribute it to, but I love this. Man with all his brilliance ends up like little children who fail to see the great giant towering in their midst because they're so happily engaged in swinging on his shoestring. T.S. Eliot once said, all our knowledge only brings us closer to our ignorance, and all our ignorance closer to death, but closer to death, not closer to God. And then he asked the question, where is the life we've lost in living? You see, this is where human wisdom gets us. So I want you to think about this. None of us would have ever come up with a plan like God. In our wisdom, we would have made it so confusing and so complex. If we had come up with a plan of redemption, you know what? It would look like the United States tax code. And we would have to devise some kind of a salvation plan on monthly installments. But God masterminded this plan in which He is both the just and the justifier, Paul says in Romans chapter 3 and verse 26. If you and I had 1,000,000 lifetimes to think and create a plan in which the perfect, holy God could be reconciled with imperfect, sinful people, we would have never thought of the cross. So Paul says in verse 22, Jews demand signs, and Greeks look for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles, but for those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. So, let's talk about some reactions to the cross. First of all, Paul says that the cross is scandalous. The Jews looked for signs. The Jews looked for miracles. In fact, I'm convinced the Jews were originally from Missouri, the show me state, because you got to show them. You prove to me, and then I'll believe. They wanted God to prove Himself to them. And catch this, in doing that, they wanted God to submit to them before they would be willing to submit to Him. Now, it's difficult to understand what crucifixion would have meant to a first century Jew, because we have sanitized and we have domesticated the cross. The cross was a form of execution. It was the worst form of execution that maybe has ever been created by humanity. It was only for the worst of offenses against the Roman Empire, like treason. And the whole purpose of coming up with this form of execution was to cause the person to go through excruciating suffering, because they would be hung publicly so that people would see that and go, if they're even thinking about doing anything treasonous, I don't want to do that because I might end up there. The pain was so intense, and people often lived days on the cross, and the pain was so intense that they would wish they could die. Now, how could a Jew who's looking for a powerful Messiah, a warrior Messiah, how is a Jew going to be expected to put their faith in a carpenter from Nazareth who's died a shameful death? And so for them, the cross was a stumbling block. You know what the Greek word for stumbling block is? It is scandalonis, from which we get our word scandal. It was scandalous. It was offensive. But for others, it was foolish. The Greek Empire, as far as thought and education and the arts, the Greek Empire dominated Paul's world, even though the Roman Empire was actually in power. And Greeks held up their philosophers as the pinnacles of wisdom. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Zeno, Epicurus. Philosophers who still affect Western thought over 2,000 years later. And many people might consider committing themselves to God once they can figure God out. They wanted God to fit into their minds before they would allow Him to fit into their lives. And the idea of a man hanging on a cross to save the world, utter nonsense. It's foolishness. But catch this. To the proud person who demanded miracles and proof, and to the intellectual who insisted upon explanations in order to believe God, God offered them both the same thing. The story of a crucified Messiah is their only hope for deliverance. And that story, believed in and lived into, effectively accomplishes what human beings cannot, which is salvation, which is a deliverance from ourselves. But then Paul says, thirdly, that the cross is the power and wisdom of God. He says for those who are called, which is the same thing as verse 21, those who believe, verse 18, us who are being saved. Again, it's worth noting that Paul did not alter his message when he turns from a Jewish audience to a Gentile audience. The message is still the same. He preached Christ crucified. And this is the message all creation needs to hear and believe. Have you ever heard athletes doing any trash talking? When I was in high school, I was the sports editor for both our school newspaper and our school yearbook. And one year I was invited to a conference. Now this was in the early to mid 70s. I was in a conference where Mike Ditka was one of the speakers. Now at that time, Mike Ditka, I think, was still an assistant coach for the Dallas Cowboys. And he tells this story. He was a Hall of Famer that played for the Chicago Bears, but then coached for the Cowboys. Well, one game, the Cowboys and the Bears were playing each other, and this was when Walt Garrison was the fullback. You remember Walt Garrison? This guy was tough as nails. He was a rodeo guy. He, one game, had 36 yards of tape wrapped around him. He had so many injuries, and he was the star of the game. It was a playoff game. This guy was tough. So, as Ditka's telling the story, he said Walt Garrison ran several plays up the middle, and every time Dick Butkus, who was maybe the best linebacker in the history of the NFL, would just eat him up. He said about the third time, Butkus picked him up off the ground, and he looked him in the eye, and he said, "You come my way one more time today, and I'm going to bite your head off." And he sat him back down. And he said Garrison started to go back to the huddle, but then he turned around and he came back toward Ditka and he said, "Let me tell you something. You bite my head off, you'll have more brains in your stomach than you do in your head." That may be the ultimate trash talk. But here in this passage, Paul does a little trash talking on the account of God. He says, for the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. Paul's saying that if it were possible for God to be foolish and weak, his foolishness and weakness is still going to amaze us. So, man, we need to embrace the cross. So let me give you quickly 3 things that we need to do to embrace the cross. Number 1 is to reflect on its wonder. The scandal of the cross, a form of execution, has been lost for us. Perhaps because it was still such a shocking thing in the 1st and 2nd centuries, the cross was not the symbol of Christianity in those early days. A fish was, the ichthus. It was only in the 4th century under King Constantine that the cross became known as the symbol of Christianity. But today the cross has kind of lost its wonder. It used to be you kind of had a hint that someone that you saw on TV was a believer if they had a cross around their neck or cross earrings. But now unbelievers are even wearing a cross. It's lost its meaning in many ways. But to a large degree, it's been emptied of its significance. And so I really think that we need to pray for ourselves. Lord, take me back to the cross and help me to see it as the power and the wisdom of God. Secondly, as we cross over into the world, we must be sure to cross over with the cross. I'm very disturbed about what's happening in America today with American evangelicals. These evangelical Christians, which we would somewhat be classified as evangelical Christians, who are putting their trust in power politics, who are thinking that there's some politician or some president who's going to promote the cause of Christianity, and what they're doing is they're rubbing elbows with the devil. And it's taken the faith and crossed over without the cross. You remember what God said to King Hezekiah? I don't need human help to do my will. I don't need politicians. Christianity without the cross is like music without a tune. And when we talk about the faith, we better make a beeline to the cross. This is what makes our message unique. The cross is what makes our message powerful. And third, it takes a crucified church to bring a crucified Christ before a lost world. The cross makes human wisdom foolish. The cross insults human intelligence because it's not sophisticated enough. The cross insults human ability because there's nothing that we add. The cross insults human ambition because there's no glory for us in it. The church that God will use for great things in this world is going to appear to be weak and foolish. But this is so that those who seek may see the power and the wisdom of God and not us. Ultimately, all that we believe is wrapped up in the cross of Jesus Christ. It is the core truth of the Christian faith. It is the preeminent event in human history. It is our message, it is our hope, it is our confidence. Though the world despise it, we rally around it. Let us love the cross. Let us preach the cross. Let us never be ashamed of the cross. Let us hold it high as a banner of our salvation. Let us lift it up as the hope of the world. There is no power like the power of the cross. It can lift us out of our sins. It can release us from condemnation. It can give us new life. It can set us on a new path. Mighty is the power of the cross. And we're going to sing about that right now as we offer you an opportunity to respond to the invitation of Jesus, to be baptized, to come for prayer, or make your way to room 102 where you can meet with an elder and his wife there. Let's stand and sing of the power of the cross.
Oh, to see